power of analysis was so underutilized and undertapped. Until after 9/11, when we opened up the community to this idea that modern technology is going to give you capabilities that you never had before, and you need to be in the field next to collectors. And you need to be in the field supporting with analytic product that's relevant. And that means you got to be smarter.
Kind of one of the conclusions on what happened with 9/11 is that, things were too stovepiped and information wasn't getting shared. And we were missing out because analysts and collectors weren't collaborating enough to make sure that we're able to connect the dots and maybe not missing some big pieces.
Same with expertise. One of the D&I initiatives was the Analysis Resource Catalogue, or ARC. There was no way to find, except through word of mouth, or calling around, hey, do you know the DIA guy that's selling Iraq's chemical weapons? That's the way we found, or if we happened to work on an estimate together, then you would have naturally collaborated. So made perfect sense to try to build some way of cataloging what expertise do we have and where are they and what's the depth of their experience on that topic.
I'm Becca McGregor, formerly Becca Thompson, and I was a consultant for Analytic Transformation. Yeah, I mean, if you think about like a parallel being like maybe an academic community, where they all, like to your point, they all go to conferences, and they all publish articles, and you could find everyone's email when they publish their research article, and you can follow up with them and talk to them. That was not, there's no names on PDBs and wires. You don't know who wrote it, who went into it, and how to follow up with somebody. And I just feel like that must be also like really academically or like professionally stifling in some way to not be able to find your people and interact with them. So yeah, it was very interesting that didn't exist prior.
I am John Keefe, and I was the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analytic Mission Management. Yeah, I think you had to, if you were starting with zero knowledge, you'd have to go to your colleagues at your agency to say, like, hey, do you know anybody that does this? If you've been, at an agency for a couple of years, you would have built out your own network of people who you typically collaborate with, and you could call them and say, hey, I'm looking for, and they, it's somebody at a different agency, they could help you. But yeah, it was sort of a mandralic system. Like it was all manpower intensive and or person-drolic, depending on what your preference is. But it was all manual labor to go figure out who is the person, and you had to make a bunch of phone calls. So the ARC was intended to simplify that.
This Rube Goldberg machine where you say, I need to have an answer to this question, bounce around, circle. Yeah. So very tribal, knowledge oriented. And if your boss or whomever your mentor was shrugged their shoulders like, I don't know, that's it. End of the conversation, right?
Right. I mean, again, if you've been at an agency for at least a couple of years, you have your own network. You have people that you can go and ask. But yes, it was very labor intensive to go find these folks. If you were working really in the field that you had always been working in, it probably wasn't that big of an issue. But if for national intelligence officers doing a national intelligence estimate, like, hey, I got to make sure that I'm canvassing the entire community. I can't even does Air Force intel or Navy intel, again, one of the components that we might not have interacted with that frequently, do they have something to say about fill in the blank, about the rise of China? For example, the Chinese military, Chinese Air Force, Chinese Navy. So if you didn't know those folks, you'd have to go find them and to make sure that their views were going to be represented.
Mark Lowenthal, former Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production. So let me tell you about the Analytic Resources Catalogue. So this has actually been an initiative begun by my predecessor, John Gannon, to try and figure out who are the analysts. I always had this dread fear that Tenet would come into my office one day and say, "Hey, how many China military analysts do we have?" And I would say, "Yes, we do." And if he said, "What is that as a number?" I would have said, "Vague, round." And we were doing what John Gannon aptly called anecdotal management. We had no idea who our workforce was. I mean, if the chief of staff of the Air Force is asked, "How many F-15 pilots do you have?" he doesn't have the answer, but there's an E-8 sitting outside his office with a computer who can bring up that number in a heartbeat. And so I decided we needed to, how do I know who to hire? How do I know who to recruit? How do I know where my holes are if I don't know who my analysts are? So we created this thing called the Analytic Resources Catalogue. It took a lot of selling around the community, as these things always do. And MITRE built the prototype for me. They were very successful at it. Kerry Buckley was in charge of the team. She did a great job. And so we would ask analysts, what are you working on now? What have you worked on in the last 5 years, but no more than 5 years, because after that you've lost all currency? What are your degrees in? I don't even want to know what school is. So if you got your degree in international relations from Bob's Transmission and IR School, that's fine. And that way we had a sense of who the analytic cadre was. Now, I had to make all sorts of deals. Again, this goes back to community. I had to promise each agency I wouldn't share their data with another agency. You know, it's like they're all playing Texas Hold'em now with this stuff. I also had to promise I wouldn't show it to Congress. I lied and said I wouldn't show it to Congress.
I'm Tom Finger. I was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and concurrently Chair of the National Intelligence Council. You didn't know how to find people. And, you know, John Gannon, again, was friend for years. Despite the INR CIA, John mostly tried to do the right stuff as far as I was concerned. And on a lot of stuff I thought he failed. And the ARC was one of them, that the security Nazis stopped that. If you put it all, it's too dangerous for counterintelligence, and people will find out the magnitude of effort that we have on different subjects. And said, I'll admit it publicly. We're interested in everything. There. And we put different amounts of people on different projects. But John approached it as a common sense, that narrow perspective of the NIC. NIC needs to be able to find people to work on and contribute to. And it's just a common sense way to run a community. He failed. Mark Lowenthal gave it another shot. Again, another good friend who thought D&I and what I was trying to do initially, he thought was really unnecessary. He changed his mind about this. But Mark did it. He approached this as, we have to be able to, we, the community management kind of stuff, have to be able to find the people. If we need a Serbo-Croat economist, linguist that can do economy, we'd be able to find them wherever they are. So nobody wanted to put their people on a free agent list. So it didn't work. That was one of the issues.
Yeah.
Who's an analyst? Can single-int people be analysts? I said, do they know something? If they know something, I want them in there. I want to be able to tap what they know in there. And how the hell can you be a single in anything? That's the problem with the chemical weapons thing in Iraq. That you can't make sense of an image if you have no access to information from other sources. You know there's a box on a rail car. You don't know what's in that box. You don't know where it's going. You know, it's a box on a rail car. It's got to be all source for everybody. And if everybody's all source, they all ought to be in the catalog.
Dr. Lowenthal again.
The biggest pushback I got was from NSA. And there's also there was this very odd Jesuitical or Talmudic debate within the community. Who is an analyst? Now, CI people say, well, if you're not an all-source analyst, you're not an analyst. Wrong. If somebody at Fort Meade considers themselves an analyst, I'm happy. They're an analyst. And so my idea was, if you think you're an analyst, you're in the system. But NSA, I had to go to NSA because they refused to take part. They said, this is privacy. And I reverted to Snotty immediately. I said, excuse me, I'm not asking you what car you drive, who you sleep with, or what cereal you eat for breakfast. I'm asking you, what jobs do you do with U.S. government tax dollars? This is not privacy. So I had to call the Durance. I had to call Mike and say, Mike, I got a problem. And he beat them into shape. And we had a data call the next year. NSA refused to take part. I called the Durance again. And I said, Mike, we got a problem. He said, I thought I fixed that. I said, only 1 year in a row.
Teresa Smetzer.
Right away. Well, what's the definition of an analyst? Are they all source or single source? Some analysts only look at one source. I don't think we should include those. Well, no, I think we should. Okay, there's security concerns. We can't do that. That's not secure. Well, it's on a classified system. Why is it not secure? I mean, people were pretty creative at coming up with reasons why that shouldn't exist.
Now we hear again from Tom Fingar.
Because I had the enormous leeway, not just in recruiting people, but in doing everything. I mean, Negroponte made clear to me at the beginning, he had lots of stuff on his plate that he needed to deal with. He said, I don't want to deal with analysis. You deal with analysis. And one of the first directives transferred to me, or delegated to me, all the authorities that he had analytically. And because I had the NIC and the PDB, I didn't have to go through community coordination, community management. Let's spend 2 years drafting some kind of. I could simply decree, this is the way we're going to do it. That I had that authority, and in describing why analysts should want to be in the ARC, I said, put it this way, if you're not regarded as enough of an expert to be in the ARC, you're not writing for the NIC, and you're not writing for the PDB. That if you think you don't know enough, and your boss thinks you don't know enough, I think you don't know enough, and you're not writing. And Pat Kennedy, who was the deputy for management, again, a friend out of the State Department, said one more thing. If your analysts aren't in Finger's database, they're not in a funded position. We're reconciling budget numbers to the ARC. I got 1,200 more analysts, I think, in a week. I don't think Pat intended to do that. I don't know how I actually would have enforced it. But it broke the logjam. And once people discovered, and once we put A-Space in place, and then it made it easy to not just find, but contact and exchange information.
Now we hear again from Mark Lowenthal.
We ended up with this data set, and I wrote a cover memo for the director, and he sent it back saying, this is fascinating. We've never looked at our analytic cadre as a single unit. I said, exactly. And it really was fascinating. We knew we had a better sense of the languages, was also responsible for the language programs. We finally had a sense of who we were. And what my model for this, I said, God forbid there's a crisis in Georgia. This is before there was a crisis in Georgia. I said, God forbid there's a crisis in Georgia. I'd like to have an analyst who thinks about Tbilisi before she thinks about Atlanta, just as a starting point. And so it was very successful. We built that, and then the DNI's team inherited it and took credit for it. But that was before they got on board. So that one worked.
What do you mean there's no library of national intelligence or a repository where all of the product is that any analyst could go see what had already been done on their topic? What do you mean that doesn't exist?
Teresa Smetzer.
Well, that seems like one that would be really good, right? So that was another one that seemed kind of shocking, actually, that it didn't already exist. Now, there were legitimate security issues, particularly for things that were more sensitive. for sure. But there was a lot of stuff that could have been shared, and why start with a blank sheet of paper when there's already been 3 or 4 things written that you can draw from to then elaborate on whatever your specific task is.
Michael Wertheimer, Assistant Deputy Director and Chief Technology Officer for Analysis at the Office of the DNI. The second one was the Library of National Intelligence, which was meant to be a repository for all intel reporting. And if you had the right clearance, you could see what's being reported on something, regardless of what agency you're in. What is being reported out of NSA? We found that if an embassy found some intelligence and forwarded it through the system, and a product report, some actual intelligence product was produced, maybe even made it to the President's Daily Brief, they weren't on the distribution list. So you're producing intelligence, but you actually had no view of the report that came out on your very intelligence. There was a lot of that. It was a one-way flow. And so intelligence would flow in, people would write reports, it would flow out to the decision makers, but there was no feedback loop. So that was really important. The Library of National Intelligence was meant to do that. How do we collaborate a little more with a feedback loop? So we could see when we got it wrong, who got it right, how did they get it right, what were their sources, and the like.
What do they have you working on? What's the first thing you're working on?
The first thing was the Library of National Intelligence, which took me a few days to figure out wasn't a real library.
So we decided the whole concept was at least make fact of known. So there was a place that you could query. And by querying this database, you might be able to find out there is something of value and then make the request. So the Library of National Intelligence was not designed to be a library where you could check out every book. 90% of the Library of National Intelligence was the card catalog that was open. So you could see the card catalog entry, to use a very, very old term, and then request, if you needed, to see the document. If you didn't need a special access, you could access it right there. Finished products had a distribution list. And if you are on the distribution list, you got it. If the report had this caveat called ORCON, which stood for Originator Controlled, and you received it, you could not share that report with anybody else without going back to the source and requesting permission. It had to be on the distribution list. If someone was aware, they could request it from the originator. It wasn't, I wouldn't call it a kludgy process, but you had to be on distribution. And as I mentioned, when I would go to field sites, to embassies and the like, they would originate reports and not be on the distribution. So it would come to the embassy, to like the station chief, and it sort of came from them, but they never saw the finished product. They weren't on the distribution. So you may not know what was available because you weren't on distribution, especially with ORCON, because you couldn't, if someone knew you needed to know, they could forward it to you if it wasn't ORCON, and you had the proper clearance. It was a terrible system for discovery. Add this, and we made the CIA the executive agent, which makes sense. The CIA being central, and all of a sudden, all the reporting starts showing up at CIA.
Now we hear again from Mark Lowenthal.
So can you tell us about, like, what was it like to find a product somewhere as part of your baseline research of, like, here's what we said before, now here's the new question or an old question that we have to answer now. How did you go through that process?
Unless it was an NIE, or unless it was something that your office did, you had no idea. In fact, I remember in Neiman's early days, it was easier to just recollect on a target than ask yourself, what did you get? Have we collected recently on this target? Because they couldn't find the imagery. So No, I thought the idea. Look, I love libraries. I worked at the Library of Congress for many years. Like most of us, I have this very large library in my house. I love libraries, but the key to a library is the card system. Well, it used to be the cards, and now you find online. That there are multiple ways to search this, so there has to be a repository somewhere. So I thought that was a terrific idea. That's something analysts would get. They would understand that let's see what else. What do we say about this a couple of years ago?
Here's Dr. Wertheimer's reaction.
And the Library of National Intelligence stood on its own. People found value. It was easy for the production just to add another feed. I think that was seen as mostly neutral because it was controlled very well, much to the community's credit. While it filled up initially mostly with open source reporting, they were happy to populate it. We got millions and millions of documents quickly in there, up to and including Orcon. We didn't get the special, compartmented information. I don't know if that's still true or not. I've been out of it so long. But it turned out to be a huge value add, the discovery that something was reported on what you cared about. And then you could request the document. It sounds like a simple thing, but it wasn't. Nothing was at that time. But I would say of all the initiatives we had, the Library of National Intelligence was the easiest to pull off.
What existed before the National Intelligence Priorities Framework?
That is a great question. I don't know.
John Keefe again.
And I always want to make sure that Mark Lowenthal, when I was on the Hill, Mark Lowenthal came and briefed the National Intelligence Priorities Framework to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And it was impressive back then, right? Like if you understood what the intel community was trying to do, which is I got all these different issues, and I got all these countries and all these terrorist groups and drug groups, and like they're not all equal. So I have to attach a priority to give some guidance to the community about what do we think is really important and what do we think is less important. And so that eventually became what everybody knows as the NIPF matrix, National Intelligence Priorities Framework matrix, and it was a list of issues across the top and a list of countries and groups down the left-hand side, and then in the squares where the issues and the groups or countries intersect, there's a number on a scale of 1 to 5. How important is this? 1 was the most important, and 5 I think was no number was the least important. And so I think there were something like 9,000 possibilities, and so we used one of the first questions was how many elements in the matrix have a number in it, and I think when I inherited the NIPF it was something like it was on the order of 4,000 or something like that. So almost half of this matrix is actually a priority, which didn't quite sit right with us, and that what was going on was that agencies had figured out, especially in the internal budget battles, that if you had a high NIPF priority, then you could get funding.
Now we hear again from Dr. Lowenthal.
So the NIPF is the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. Some people call it the NIPF. I don't like that acronym. It's how the intelligence community gets from the policymakers what are your major areas of concern, and then we use that to figure out, well, do we have the right collection? Do we have the right analysis to take care of these major needs? The genesis for this, again, was John Gannon. Bill Clinton was not terribly interested in intelligence. It did not grab him as an issue, for whatever reason. And Tennant had gotten him to sign what was called the TIERS system, TIERS, in 95 or 96. And could never get it updated. Clinton just wasn't going to deal with it again. So by the time we got to 2000, the tier system was way out of whack. Also, the tier system turned out was very easily gamed. It was very easy to get an easier priority for your issue or country if you knew how to game the system, so that wasn't successful. And so Gannon had asked Clapper and me, we work in the private sector together, to come up with a different system, an alternative method for dealing with priorities. And we had a team of people from our company, SRA, a lot of people from Cytor, and we started building this prototype system. Clinton left office, Bush came in, 9/11 happened, Clapper went to head NGA, or NEMA as it then was. I went back to work at CIA, and there was all this work we had done, and I decided to keep pushing it forward. Now, one of the interesting things, when I went back to work at the agency, George never said, I need you to do this and this and this and this. He needed me to help support the investigations. That was the primary issue. Everything else I was left on my own. And I decided we're going to rebuild the priority system along the lines that this team that Jim and I had headed had built. We built the system that we thought worked. The interesting thing was, and tells you a lot about intelligence reform. You do not reform the intelligence community by standing on top of Mount Langley and saying, my children, I have come to reform the intelligence. I have these tablets, and you will follow me. No one's going to listen to you. It's a retail operation, and so we did briefings. Mark Scott was my deputy at the time, and Mark Roth was the action officer for this, great officer. And we did briefings of policy and intel stakeholders, one by one by one. And after each briefing, we'd show them who else we were briefing, any suggestions. If one of them made a change that we really liked, we'd go back and tell them. And the briefings started to pile up. And I said to Mark Roth, because he was the one who was managing all this, I said, when we get to briefing 100, I buy you a really good bottle of champagne. Well, Mark got his bottle of champagne. And we got to 130 briefings. And we were ready to go. We prototyped the system. Actually, we'd done a lot of beta testing before Jim and I came back to the government. And the system was built, and so it was going to be on the agenda for an NSC meeting in February of 2003. And no, not February. I came back in March. February 3. I came back March 2002. So as we're walking into the sit room, George says to me, "Is this a done deal?" He stops me as we're walking. I said, "Yes." He said, "Why are you so sure?" I said, "Because after 130 briefings, nobody in my row is going to goose anybody in your row." And so we're the last item on the agenda. And NSC meetings, people are highly structured meetings, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. These are busy people. We're the last item. George, I'm sitting behind George. He says, "Do you want to brief it?" I said, "Oh, no, you brief it." And so he briefed it. There was this fascinating debate about the priorities, about which ones went where and so on. The president signed it.
John Keefe.
So the process that used to exist was that analysts would gather as working groups under all these, there were different issue groups, and you would debate about what countries were the most important to consider in these. And because it was analyst-driven, there was nobody there to break the tie. This is how you eventually creep up to 4,000 numbers in a matrix. And so one of the things we said is look, priority ones have to be reserved for the president and his most senior staff, to include the cabinet secretaries. And so that Mike McConnell was the one that helped orchestrate this. We actually would do a principals committee discussion about national intelligence priorities with a piece of paper. It would be the top level. We simplified it so that nobody had to look at the blizzard of numbers that was just reserved for us. But we put the ones that we thought were sort of near the top, and then would let them speak to those, and they'd say okay, this is much more important than this. And so he, as he used to say, what's the piece of paper that's sitting on the table when the principals discuss this? And so we had worked out what that ought to look like, and that was generally informed both by our sense of within the community, but also the demand signal coming out of the president's daily brief, and then what was the feedback that we were getting. We also carved out priority twos for the combatant commanders, so that was a way of guaranteeing that the military had a solid voice. And of course, combatant commanders could look at where the National Security Council was going to come out, and they might gripe why don't I get a priority one? But in fact, a lot of them would already be overlapping with what the National Security Council Principals Committee was going to say. And so what they were looking for is, all right, I get some additional votes here on what's priority two that is not already priority one. So I'm going to lay down a couple markers.
That's very clever.
Yeah, and what it did was it got folks invested in and making sure that their voices were heard, and then the rest was left to working groups that analysts just sorted out. But then, again, because Tom had handed this off to me, one of the tasks was, okay, we have too many priorities. We've had priority inflation for several years now, and so you need somebody who's willing to take everybody else's Christmas presents away. that was a bit what it was like, and hey, we're going to go from 4,000, and I think we eventually got it down to 1,200 priorities. So it was massive reduction, and then and accompanying that was the getting into the top tier of priority ones. It was now really difficult. It had to be an issue that the National Security Council was looking at, and that we left room for folks like the DNI or Tom or Mary Margaret Graham to weigh in and say, like, well, this issue is going to be important in the next couple of years. We need to make sure the community is continuing to work it. So there were exceptions that you could work into this, but now they were very strictly controlled. It couldn't just be a cabal of analysts that said we all voted and this thing that we think is important is now going to be an NIPF priority one.
Now we hear again from Tom Fingar.
Yeah, John made that a much more meaningful. When that was given to me a couple years into this, I said, John, you got to do something with it. I'm giving it to you because you figure stuff out. I said, but there's no way in hell I can keep a straight face and justify the 1,317 highest priorities of the U.S. government. I can't say that with a straight face. You got to figure out a way. It's a priority. It's not a wish list.
Now we hear again from John Keefe.
The idea of the matrix was for resource trades, right, or inform resourcing for collection and analysis.
Yeah, it was designed to do both, and we used to say it's guidance, it's not a straitjacket, and so but NGA would use it in figuring out what things do they need to go look at. NSA would use it in where should we go put collection emphasis, and then what should we be looking to do in terms of our own analytic production. CIA would look at it in a similar way. It would guide their own collection efforts, and then it would guide the production of finished intelligence. And so in that sense, it worked pretty well. But if you were looking for this matrix of numbers to really resolve difficult issues, as we would say, like, you all have an agency director, so that this is the guidance from the DNI, and there were changes that we made during the period of time where I was managing it. One of the changes was we reserved priority ones. It was no longer just enough for analysts to say, well, I have a priority one. Like, you needed the National Security Council to weigh in and say, that's our priority. The other thing we did, again, this is a joke with my team, Liz O'Reilly was the one that ran that team and is still one of my favorite people that I've worked with. I used to say, I look at the matrix and it's just a blizzard of numbers. I can't sort it out. So we added color coding to it. So, and we used to tell people, if you want to see where the top priorities are, let your eyes gravitate to where the red is. Because priority ones we colored in red, and eventually people sort of fell in. When you did that, you'd see there's certain countries that really do stand out at the top of this matrix, and then there's others that are kind of in the middle of the pack, and then you get the also-rans.
Now we hear again from Dr. Lowenthal.
One of the things that stunned me, we built it for George Bush. He was president. We assumed that, and we thought it was a non-denominational, non-political array, but we also assumed whoever became president next would throw it out and put in their own system. It's the NSC. Obama kept it. And after Denny Blair got fired, he was doing a guest lecture for me in one of my courses. We're out at Omaha, Stratcom. We're having dinner, and I said, Denny, you kept the NIPF. Why? He said, well, it works. And I said, I got to tell you, that's never been a good enough reason before. Now, it's changed a lot since we first built it, as well it should. But it works. It's a non-denominational... the fact that it worked for Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump, tells you a lot about the fact that this thing really is non-political. And it was the first time that we were able to get the policymakers to tell us what are their priorities, and then use that to shape the things we did in U.S. intelligence.
You have been listening to the podcast series From Tragedy to Transformation, Intelligence Reform After 9/11, sponsored by the Unredacted Podcast. The interviews you heard were conducted by me, Brian Drake. We would like to thank our many contributors to this series: Don Burke, Sean Dennehy, Margaret Dillard, Tom Fingar, Jeff Fowler, Nicole Gibson, Richard Immerman, John Keefe, Mark Lowenthal, Rebecca McGregor, Joan McIntyre, Carmen Medina, Louis Shepard, Teresa Smetzer, Mike Wertheimer,
Sean Woltman, and Jesse Wilson. From Tragedy to Transformation was produced by Lindy Kaiser and Brian Drake with support from Sean Dennehy, Jim Clapper, and Chris Rasmussen. If you have any questions or comments about this series, please reach out to us at questions@unredactedpodcast.com. And thank you.